Hello, Drew. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
It is my privilege, and thank you for expanding my vocabulary one word at a time. Here's amanuensis, a person employed to write what another dictates or to copy what has been written by another secretary. So I'm seeing your tongue deeply embedded in your cheek as you call yourself the amanuensis.
Well, it started when I was writing a column for National Review magazine about 10 years ago, and I created a character called David Kahane, the name of which I borrowed from the movie The Player, who's the screenwriter who gets murdered by the producer. And so I wrote the character as a crazy Hollywood leftist. And for years, no one knew who actually wrote that column, and people were speculating and saying to NRO that you've gone lefty and who is this person? And I finally came out of the closet as myself, but I decided that since I'd been writing Kahane, I was his amanuensis, and that became the origin of my Twitter handle.
Got it.
And so here we are. I know it's hard to
The rest is history.
Yes.
And speaking of remembering, I'm recalling that the producer killed the screenwriter behind the Rialto Theater, which you'll be glad to know has reopened and been restored as a church. But it's still there. It's still there.
Wow. I was just in Pasadena on Friday, as a matter of fact, Drew. I just came back from a week in California. I spoke about Rage to Conquer over at the Lux Hotel at an event sponsored by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the American Freedom Alliance by Karen Sigmund. So we had a good crowd, and it was nice to be back in LA. I hadn't been back for a few years.
It's not much to celebrate, but we're here. So let's talk about against the corporate media. But I don't know if you were listening at all to what I was discussing with Chrissy, but one of my theories is that the media, whether it was being sort of actually the individual members of the media literally became delusional and hysterical. And I mean that quite literally, like clinically relevant delusionality, which I saw in evidence during COVID. I mean, I believe that's what happened, but I believe something happened earlier when either they were manipulated or propagandized themselves or bought into as a result of what they were being led to believe, perhaps by the government at the time, that the government was about to, I mean, remember Chris Cuomo going, today is a day that will go down in infamy. A Russian operative sits in the Oval Office. He said that with a straight face. He believed that. That is disgusting. He should be apologizing every day of his life for that kind of insanity. And he should be struggling to kind of understand how he went so far from reality. And they all did. And they all convinced themselves this man is Hitler. Therefore, anything is okay. Any lying, any manipulation. Tell me about your argument in the book.
Well, let me just give you a little bit of background on myself. I started in newspapers in 1972. That was the summer of Watergate, and I was a young police reporter, cub reporter at the Rochester, New York Democrat and Chronicle, right out of college. And so we learned our journalism craft to report honestly what we saw, to call it as we saw it, and without injecting any opinion in the process, insofar as that is possible. But there was such a thing as objectivity. I would disagree with you slightly. I will tell you that, because I've known many of these guys who are at the top of the profession and still in the news right now for 50 years, half a century. They knew exactly what was wrong with Biden. They lied on purpose. They weren't delusional. They knew it was a problem. If you talk to them privately, as I did many, many times over the last 5 decades, they will tell you privately, you're right. Privately, Trump is not Hitler. Privately, Ronald Reagan wasn't a cowboy. Privately, we're not going to start World War III. But they were and are committed to this cause. And I had further experiences during
the cause being what? Would define the cause for me.
It's the leftist cause that conservatism is
Marxism. Is it Marxism? Is it socialism? Is it collectivism? What is there? Do they have a cohesive philosophy? Is it John Rawls? What is it?
Yeah, it's progressivism, I suppose we would call it now. But they tended to be politically liberal from the beginning. I worked at Time Magazine, as you pointed out, Drew, for 16 years. And I never had a political conversation with any of my colleagues at Time. It just did not come up. But there's been a split, there's been a break. And the old story was that if you were a political activist, you either went into the law or journalism. If you weren't smart enough to go to law school, you became a journalist. But you were still committed to the social justice cause. And many of these men are my good friends, but I am appalled and ashamed as I write in Against the Corporate Media in my own essay called A Higher Loyalty, that they chose to deliberately misrepresent the facts that were evident to all of us. And you were right about COVID, about the Russian hoax, all these things that men like you and me and our friends and colleagues called out at that moment and were derided for. They just simply did not want to admit the truth. And what will happen with Biden is, as Tapper showed yesterday with Megyn Kelly, they'll take a certain amount of a beating and say, oops, and then they will go right out and do it again. They will not learn a single thing from this.
Well, that's disturbing to me. I want to believe that if we can understand it more clearly, we can at least put some sort of safeguards in place, whether it's just being prepared to do battle in a more systematic way, because it was confusing. And if in retrospect, it looks like a psyop, right? It looks like when you silence alternative opinions, that's psyop. That is and the fact that the press was deeply into that is far beyond derision and all the way into a systematic propaganda campaign in which people are hurt and sidelines and pushed aside in the name of this cause. But I want to go back to something you said there about not discussing politics with your peers. I was on CNN HLN for almost 10 years, okay? No one ever told me what to say. They'd ask me, they go, hey, you got something to say this evening? I go, fine. Here, we'll see you on Anderson Cooper. We'll see you on Don Lemon. Speak your mind. Go ahead. They never did. They never suggested what I should say. And I had a nightly show on HLN. No one ever said anything about politics to me until I had a intern who was a journalism student at Columbia. And I'll always remember this. It was probably halfway through my run at CNN HLN. And she went, well, what's the story? What's the story? And I go, what's the story? This is just a bunch of facts here, and maybe we can form a theoretical frame for understanding those facts. There's no story. Stories are false. It's particularly the things I comment on in biology. I mean, it's like, what's the story on the behavior of that cloud? There's no story there. You can make a story, and it will be it's detached from reality. And she eventually told me, she goes, in school they're hammering on us that you always have to find the narrative, find the story, and don't bother. And I thought, oh well, this is going to result in really serious problems. And I immediately stopped doing all print interview. I do not do any print interview, because if they're going to interview you trying to find the story, what are we doing here? I'm telling you.
The old joke is that all journalists deep down inside want to be screenwriters. They do. And that's because the beginnings of Hollywood, they actually were journalists who went out to Hollywood and became screenwriters. As one of them famously wrote back to his partner in Chicago on one of the Chicago newspapers, you got to come out here. The money is great and the competition are schmucks. And so many journalists feel they've got to frame this as a story. Now I'll tell you exactly when this started, Drew, and I can remember it was the Iran-Contra hearings during the Reagan administration. Now, by way of autobiography, between 1985 and 1991, I spent a great deal of time in East Germany, in East Berlin, and in Moscow and in Leningrad, what was then Leningrad. I was in Moscow, and I was in Leningrad when the Chernobyl blew up. I left Russia just 2 weeks before the coup against Gorbachev. I was in Berlin in '89 when the wall came down, and I have pieces of it here in my house in rural New England. So I was already used to seeing state-run media and how the disparity had opened up in both of those societies between what was true and self-evident and what was official. And that has now come to the United States as far as our media is concerned.
Yes. Well, so Michael, I want to share two stories with you. One is, I remember in the 70s, I don't know why it stayed with me so vividly, but it struck me at the time, and it's come back to me in the recent years, and you'll hear why. It was like a news magazine, sort of Michael Walsh or somebody, interviewing a news anchor for Pravda in Moscow, and who are some of the old guys on 60 Minutes? Give me another name.
Was Charles guys? No, it wasn't Charles Corral.
It wasn't Charles Corral. Was it Michael Wallace? That's the right name. I don't think that's the right name, but
yeah, Mike Wallace was part of that. There was a whole group of very distinguished journalists.
Yes. Anyway, he went to Moscow. He went to Moscow and he was hammering this anchor, and the anchor finally looked up at him and said, "Hey, in your country, media is a commercial enterprise. In ours, it is a political enterprise. In either case, there will be distortions. You'll see." And I thought, it just sent a chill down my spine when I heard him say that. And I would argue that the commercial and the political is sort of blended in this country a little bit, and we're getting this distortions from both. We have drug companies dictating, the what journalists can and can't talk about because of their funding of the news, the evening news, and we have people sitting in the anchor seats who believe they have a political agenda. It's the worst of both worlds. That's one story. The other story is, I was listening to some French radio a couple weeks ago, and they had a woman on who became essentially the CEO or editor of Russian TV in Paris. And during the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, they became acutely paranoid about Russians and arrested her for being a propaganda or being I forget her name too. I wish I could remember it. But she was essentially a Putin puppet, all that nonsense. And she was on radio going, she's written a book about it. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the book's name is. I'll try to remember. But it was something like, accused. It was something, like something like what Zola would say. And she said, she goes, I was a French citizen. I'd been living here for 15 years, and I got a job because I spoke Russian, and I was good at it, and I managed this television station. And this is all paranoia. And she says, the point of this story is the following. She says, Russia is not a Soviet system any longer. It's not a Soviet Union in Russia. But the people of Russia have been inoculated against propaganda because of their experience under Soviet rule. They know what propaganda is. They don't listen to bullshit. You people become delusional when somebody propagandizes you. And I thought, God, she is so right. She is so right.
That is absolutely correct. In my time in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, you're generally accompanied by a translator or a babysitter, someone to watch, make sure you don't get into trouble. And in my private conversations with them, they were very frank about the true state of affairs. I like to tell people that in the Soviet Union, when I was there between 86 and 91, almost literally, every man was bribable and every woman was a freelance prostitute, almost within a certain age group. So you could get your way by moving in the black interstices of that country. And that's how people flourished. They listened to all the rock music they could get. I had a friend there who basically bootlegged rock albums in the 80s from our American 60s and 70s. And so to say one last thing about this, I came back in 86. I went with Vladimir Horowitz, the famous great pianist. And President Reagan had us to the White House. And that was the episode where Nancy Reagan fell off the stage, but that's a whole nother story. I went on to the Lynn Samuels show in New York, and she was a leftist, liberal talk show host on WABC, I think. And I said in 86, Germany will be reunited within 5 years. And everybody laughed at me. And I was way off because it was 3 years that Germany was reunited. But my point is, if you're a good journalist or an honest journalist, you go in objectively without preconditions. And you could see these countries were doomed. They were collapsing. They had collapsed morally, but nothing worked. The place was a mess. It stank to high heaven. There's a smell about communist countries you never get out of your nose. And so when they both came down, I wasn't surprised. It's just that we were so committed, and I must say our government, especially the CIA, was so committed to the notion that the Soviets were our antithesis, another first world country with nuclear weapons. And I said, you got to be kidding. It's a third world country of peasants with nuclear weapons, which actually makes it more dangerous than you think it is. So I would just say, to the point about the media, just tell the truth, for God's sakes. It's not that hard. And don't let people badger you into framing it into some kind of overarching narrative, as you discovered on CNN.
So let's talk a little bit about the ways the press hates you. I don't want to give too much because I want people to go read the book. But give us a taste of what your sort of theoretical frame is there. And I'm most interested in what we do about it. I know you sound a little bit fatalistic about it. I always want to do something.
Well, I think being 75 has taught me that wishes and reality sometimes don't coincide. But what we did in this book is I asked 40 other writers, many people of very distinctive and honorable bylines, to attack the media from all sides. So we did it as a political entity. We did it as an entertainment medium. A number of us were critics. I wrote a piece, the two pieces that I wrote for the book. One was about my experience as a music critic and functioning in the media. We did it about propaganda. We hit it from all angles that we could. Not so much to say, how can we improve? Because that's the beginning, objectivity. That's been thrown out now, Drew. It's interesting for me to hear some of my old colleagues at Time Magazine who are on Morning Joe regularly and have large Twitter followings and have been in the State Department say, there's not two sides to every story. There's only one side. And they were literally coming out during the election and saying, you cannot write anything good about Donald Trump. That is a violation of journalistic ethics. There is only one story to be told here. And when journalism gets to that part, then what's the difference between it and Pravda? That was my question.
Or nothing.
Yeah. Nothing.
Well, Pravda, at least the people knew what they were being propagandized. I think here people still want to trust it.
Yeah, well, there were two newspapers in the Soviet Union, Pravda and Izvestia. And Pravda means truth and Izvestia means news. And people would say there's no news in the truth and there's no truth in the news. And that was pretty much how they viewed their own state-run media. And the sad thing now, Drew, is that a lot of the European media is turning into that. I live in Ireland half the year. I rebuilt my great-grandmother's birthplace. My whole family is there now. And the media in Ireland is entirely state-controlled, almost entirely. There are a couple of independent voices. But all you hear is the EU, SSR propaganda line. Untrammeled immigration is good. National borders are bad. Nationalism is bad. And you see this struggle going on in Europe that, frankly, we saw in Eastern Europe in the late 70s and into the 80s. It's distressing to watch. But as you pointed out earlier, we never really do learn. We just get to keep doing the same dumb things over and over again.
That seems to be true of historical sweep. I thought we were done with mass formation in 1947 or so, but turns out not so. But you slipped something in there that is absolutely hysterical. EU SSSR is hysterical. I've not heard that before. Well, that's really funny.
I wish I could take
true. Listen. Let's think about the EU. Not elected officials.
Right.
I believe there are, and I think this number is correct, 100 lobbyists for every single EU representative. They are paid huge amounts of money. I was listening to an interview with how they're paid. Their base salary is $150,000 a year, but they have access to all these other things. They give them millions of dollars ultimately. And if they're playing the lobbyist game, 100 lobbyists for every EU representative, this is an insanity that I don't understand how they can allow to go on. What I'm seeing, you tell me again, I don't know, maybe this is the, compared to your I don't want to say you're nihilistic, but maybe this is my excesses of youth. I'm just 5 years behind you or 7 years behind you. But I'm watching what's happening in Europe. I'm visiting. I've been there, and what I'm seeing starting to happen in the members of the EU. First of all, I was just in Croatia and Montenegro. Montenegro, not an EU member, doing 50 times better than Croatia. It's obvious. You just you land there and it's like, why is this so much better than what's going on in Croatia? But okay. What I'm seeing is, when I keep hearing the winds blowing, is this cultural sort of conversation about, well, what does it mean to be French, or what does it mean to be Italian, or what is a British, and what is the and inevitably that conversation. It started with me. I was listening to some lectures on Napoleon, and this one Napoleon expert went, he's part of our history. You have to embrace it. And so, yes, he made some mistakes, and he tried to clarify the complexity of what was going on, so there wasn't this kind of weird black-white thinking that progressivists get. And now that same lecturer yesterday just put a lecture out about, well, you know what? We were lied. The 1790 was a myth. 1789 was a myth. There are lies beneath the pavement, he called it. And I thought, oh, they're really, really trying to come to terms with things. And when they wake up, they're going to not want to be in the EU anymore, it seems to me.
Yeah, I hope not. I hope the EU falls. It's been very, very bad for Ireland. It's destroyed. As I like to say in Ireland, we were a slave state for 800 years under the British. They took our language, they took our property, they destroyed our homes, they starved us to death, they put us on coffin ships and sent us out. We had freedom for 100 years, and we couldn't wait to give it away to Brussels. Not even, I'd take London again compared to Brussels. Yeah. But it's become a slave state of the EU, and it's very sad. But you're right, Hungary is a good example. I spent a lot of time in Hungary, and that's a wonderful country under Orban. And yet our media treats Orban like he's the second coming of Hitler. It's really disgraceful. Right. I just think there's not enough honest people in journalism anymore. I think they're all activists now, and they're taught to be activists, and they think that's the job. And I come back to, so what's the difference between you and Pravda? In the end, there isn't any.
Well, there's a good book, back to my conversation about narrative. Bill Maher recommended a book to me that I'm reading for a second time right now called Cynical Theories. Have you read that book?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I wrote a review of it for some academic publication. I think that's Helen Pluckrose and is it Lindsay?
Yes.
Yes. It's very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
And it's very good. And it reminds us that academia has decided reality must be interpreted, particularly in the humanities, through something called theory, which is a complete misapplication, I dare say, an adulteration of the scientific term theory. It's like they don't understand what theories are. Anything I can think of that somehow is a narrative that frames reality is theory. And boy, that could not be farther from how science is done. Science is, you have a hypothesis, you test it. If that test confirms the hypothesis many times, now you have something you can call perhaps a theory. It's not a description. It's a formal term. But they've adapted. That's where critical theory comes from. That's where critical race theory comes from. These are all just de novo from a group or an individual's mind.
Well, I wrote a book 10 years ago that turned out to be very influential on the right. It's called The Devil's Pleasure Palace, and it's about critical theory and the Frankfurt School. I mean, that's a whole other subject, but those people applied cultural Marxism, a phrase they deny that cultural Marxism exists, so you know it must exist, and they took it to every aspect of our lives. And it really found root in academia. It started at Columbia and it moved all across the country. And we're dealing with the end stage of that now with what's going on at our major universities. They're collapsing under the weight, just as communism did, of reality eventually overtakes theory and theory collapses.
Hold on. Stop right there. That's very different than your pessimism 10 minutes ago. Because that's the truth. That's what I hang on to. The notion that the truth has a way of asserting itself.
Oh, it does. I'm pessimistic about the media as it's currently constituted.
Okay.
But I think
we'll take care of that with programs like this. The market will take care of it. Seriously, the market will handle it. This is the thing. I saw, was it Joe, somebody talking about, it was Tim Dillon. Tim Dillon was being grilled for, what he'd cracked the code. He's like, no, I'm a funny guy, speak my mind. People are hungry for it. The market is determining it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's what's cracking the media finally. And it's why they're collapsing. And it's why Tapper, who by the way, used to be the press spokesman for Chelsea Clinton's mother-in-law. So Tapper goes back as a Democrat activist all the way back to Marjorie Margolis Pinsky. These guys are folding under the pressure. He'll try to get away with it. He'll say, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, and go on. But I think the audience is on to them. As an author and a screenwriter, you make your living because of your audience, the way you do. And if your audience abandons you, there's nothing you can really do. You've done the damage, or you've attracted the audience, and they depend on you to deliver what you believe is the truth. And I think in that sense, the truth will out. But this media, as it's constructed, won't survive that, because it can't. The New York Times and the Washington Post too deep into it now.
Well, interesting. I was thinking about, for some reason, it's funny we're having this conversation because I didn't know this is where we were going to go, but I'm realizing as I talk to you, I've had Dave Rubin on my mind the last couple of days, in the sense that he had a transformation. He was speaking to, I'm blanking on the guy's name. Anyway, Dave Rubin, who was a hardcore progressivist at the time, was hammering, God, I can see him like he's sitting right here, but in any event, hammering him, saying, cops are killing black men. And he fired back with, what's the data? Show me the data. And he quoted the data, and Rubin was like, like smoke coming out of his ears. And that moment is where he started going, wait a minute, I'm being manipulated. I'm being lied to. They planted these ideas in my head that aren't real. And he continued to get back into reality. I am wondering if he has been in my mind lately because I'm hoping for, or maybe I'm sensing that more people get to go through that transformation, where at least they can come back to an assimilation of an approximation of reality.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, he's friends with Jordan Peterson, whom I've known for a long time and respect. And you're seeing this with someone like Bill Maher, who I met 20 some years ago at the Aspen Comedy Festival. In fact, it was when Cadet Kelly came out. And I said to myself and to others, Bill's not really a hardcore leftist. He's really kind of conservative in his own personal beliefs. He's a libertarian who wants to be left alone to do this and that. And he now feels, as he says all the time on his show, that I didn't leave the party left me. And I think Dave Rubin is the same way. And there are a lot of those guys. Yep. We welcome them under any circumstances they want to come and say, yes, this is the truth. This is propaganda. This is fantasy.
Yeah, Bill has always, Larry Elder, who's who I was trying to think of. Larry Elder is who contributed the conversion with Dave Rubin. Bill has always been a truth seeker. He's the one that recommended the Cynical Theory book to me. And I know him well. In fact, he and I bonded. I went to Amherst College. He went to Cornell back in the 70s, where the pursuit of the truth and careful analytical thought was our 24/7 preoccupation. Some of it was through humanities and some of it was through science, when science obviously had a very rigorous approach to it. We bonded on that. We saw it in each other in terms of how we think and spoke, and it created a friendship. He recommended this book, and I'm remembering now, back when he used to do Politically Incorrect, I used to do that show a lot. And when he got up and made a joke about the terrorists that flew the plane into the building being cowards, and he's saying, I don't know what you can say. The one thing, they weren't cowards. He was making a joke, number one. Number two, it was a little soon. It was hard to swallow. they fired him the next day.
Right.
ABC. It was on ABC back in those days. And I called him. I said, dude, I stand behind you. You're just telling, you're just speaking the truth is what you always do. You can count on me. As long as you keep speaking the truth, I'm in your court. And well, I don't know if he remembers that, but I hope he does, because I still feel the same way.
You're absolutely right, Drew. And obviously you've made some journey from X to Y over the course of your life. I mean, in many ways, I still am a 60s liberal kid. You know, I went to college.
Yes, me too.
7.
Yes. Yeah. I was an ecologist in the 70s. That's why I called into question the climate thing. I'm like, I was convinced we were going to have an ice age. There was no doubt in my mind. And I was wrong. So it gives you some humility.
Yes, right. Well, COVID was obvious to me that it was a scam. The Russia hoax was clearly an op that was foisted on the public via the media. And you say these things, people look like you're the crazy person. And then later on, when all the truth comes out, and you say, you know, Joe Biden is a rutabaga and has been since God knows how long now, and he's not a nice man. And if you've spent any time around Washington, you know he's considered one of the stupidest and nastiest people in Congress, which is really saying something. And we all knew this. So we're sitting here going, yeah, okay, well, finally everyone sees that the emperor has no clothes. But it's just about honesty and perception. And as a writer, I tell the truth. That's what I do. Whether it's in fiction or nonfiction or the books that I edit, I stand behind what I write. And I think that's the only way to approach life.
Let's wrap up with a quick survey of the two books. What are we going to read about in the Desire to Conquer book?
Well, that's a sequel to a book called Last Stands, which came out 4 years ago and was a big bestseller for Macmillan. And they immediately commissioned a second one, and now a third one. It's about warfare, and it's about masculinity. Chrissy was talking about Dylan Mulvaney. And so masculinity, having grown up in the Marine Corps, as I did, which is an odd path to becoming a concert pianist, but I had that as a model. My father served in Korea. He's a veteran of the Chosin Reservoir. He's 99 years old in 2 weeks. I had that as a model, and I wanted to write. Last Stands was about, why do men fight when all's lost? Why don't they give up and run away? But they don't. They sit and fight, and they die to the last man, and they're proud to do it. It's not a question, because it is who a man is. And in A Rage to Conquer, I take 12 battles throughout history and the commanders who led them, and say, what characteristics do they share in person as men, as thinkers, as warriors? So I start with Achilles, and then Alexander the Great, and Caesar, and some generals most people haven't heard of, such as Aetius, the last of the Roman generals who fought Attila the Hun. Napoleon gets a big chapter. And then the third book, which I'm writing now, is called The Wrath of God.
Give me one of the traits that they share. Hey, give us a taste.
Yes, I'll give you a taste. They know when they're in a battlefield situation what the other guy did 1,000 years before. That they have a kinetic sense of the battlefield. This is really the important thing. Alexander had it, Napoleon had it, which is they know as they look at a battlefield that what's going to happen 10 minutes from now. They know where the enemy is going to be, and they're there, and they nail him. And Alexander did it to Darius 3 times in a row in his conquest of the Persian Empire. Napoleon did it most famously at Austerlitz against the Russians and the Austrians. Caesar, what he did during the siege of Alesia, Bohemond of Taranto in the First Crusade does the same thing to the Turks and the Egyptian Fatimids during the siege of Antioch. So you find these common characteristics. They take command, they're not afraid, and they fight to the end. Sometimes they lose. Napoleon eventually lost, but you've been to Paris, you know where he is. He's right on display for the entire city to see at the emblem. So I found it very illuminating. And now the third book is about religious warfare and how the most brutal fighting we have is over God. I'm not going to argue that religion is the cause of war, which is not the truth. One might equally argue that war is the cause of religion when you start with the Greeks and the ancient Hebrews, and from our common shared from 800 BC on. They are battles that are very, very nasty because they are civil, in a way, civil wars among sects of either the Abrahamic faiths. I'm going to include the Taiping Rebellion in China because it was led by a Chinese man who thought he was the brother of Jesus Christ and was fighting for Christianity in China when General Gordon, who later died at Khartoum, was hired by the Chinese government, put this rebellion down. So you find all these common threads and you link them up, and here you impose a narrative. I mean, as a writer, you're allowed to do that with these big books because you have to have a framework. Why am I talking about this? But once it gets going, it's hard work, but it's a lot of fun, and the readers have responded very well, I'm happy to say.
And then give me a couple of the ways the press hates us. There's a taste for promo.
The press believes, and this is kind of simple, that whatever they tell you is for your own good, and that you're a troglodyte and a Nazi and a whatever if you question what they do, because their virtue, like Calpurnius, is beyond, you cannot question it. And they've been in this business. I mean, I've been in it 50 years off and on. I did it 25 for real. And they believe they're sort of a priest class to government, and they really are the handmaiden of the state. And I would hope that the young reporters who start way too early and get public platforms because of the internet far too soon, so that they embarrass themselves with silly positions when they're 25 that even years later they're ashamed of. I wish we had a better media. I wish that reporters started the way my generation did, which was as a police reporter in a small or medium-sized city. So you saw violence, you saw social problems up close. You couldn't just read about it. You actually had to be there. You know, when you see your first corpse, when you smell the first house fire, and you'll never get that, and you have this visceral reaction to these things. If all you know is what you read on the internet, you don't really know much at all, unfortunately.
The-pipeline.org, is that like a Substack? What is that?
Yes, that is. It's a website, and it's moving to Substack, and it was for 4 years. I had a number of writers writing every day, mostly about energy issues, climate change. We did a lot on the COVID hoax from the beginning, which I'm assembling into a but it's now become more or less my personal website. So you can see the-pipeline.org or Michael Walsh at The Pipeline on Substack. And I'm writing once a week there, and then I'm interviewing people that I think are interesting once a week as well. So maybe we'll talk again in that form at some point soon.
I love it. I would love it. And follow him on The Amanuensis on X at The Amanuensis. And you said you're going to compile a book on the COVID hoax?
Yes, I'm calling it after Journal of the Plague Year, just like Daniel Defoe's fiction book.
Hysterical. Well, please come back and discuss that with me here. I'd love that. And then Caleb, you keep throwing up your enthusiasm for the movie. So I want to give you a chance to pull that out.
My wife says I have to highlight the greatest project of your life. It's not all your 2040 books. It's that you wrote Cadet Kelly starring Hilary Duff. My wife, I have so many OMG texts when I mentioned that to her. She says it's a classic.
You know, it was the only movie that I've gotten actually produced and made. I've sold enough scripts to be a lifetime WGA writer now, but that was the easiest project in the world. My writing partner, Gail Parent, brought me on because I knew something about military stuff. And we wrote the script, and Disney approved it. And the only hiccup in that movie was at one point, our creative executive said, well, we have a little problem with standards and practices. I said, what was it? Now, we're done, the script's done, everything's done. She said, I don't think we can use guns in this movie.
Oh, boy.
I said, it's about a military school and a drill team. That's what they use. So there is a disclaimer on this movie that says no actual guns were used in the making of this movie. Yeah. But it was, and Hillary was great, and it was the highest rated movie and the highest rated show of any kind on the Disney Channel when it came out in 2002.
I've run across Hillary a number of times down in Chelsea. I think that's where she lives in New York City. And she always seems like a real person. And so good for her.
Yeah, well, I was very glad that she did a great job in that picture.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you so much. We will check you out on all the platforms. We will get the books. We will read the books, and we will look forward to the name again. The COVID book. It's the Journals of the Plague.
A Journal of the Plague Year, just like Daniel Defoe's
Journal
famous
of the Plague Years
about Britain in the
so Journal of the Plague Years. Also, the Love and the Time of Cholera. So,
that might be the sequel.
Calls that back a little.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here.
Okay, thank you, Drew. I appreciate it.
You got it.